is Dr. Peter Fifield. I'm a lecturer in modern English literature at Birkbeck, University of London. Standing above me is Ed, who is going to be reading our poetry. He's from Pegasus Theatre. Shell shock is the iconic condition of the First World War. It's what we think of when we think of a war casualty from the Great War. It was a new term for that war and for this condition, first used in January 1915 in the British Journal of Medicine, and it was used to cover a number of different symptoms which were difficult to explain. These included nervous tremors and tics, recurrent night terrors and night sweats, heart palpitations, physical incapacities such as a stoop with no apparent cause, and many other things. The First World War was infamously, the first heavily mechanised war, and this was seen as being connected with the emergence of this new condition, this new kind of trauma. The number of shells fired, the number of extremely loud weapons used with alarming regularity on the Western Front meant that soldiers were exposed to a volume and a duration of noise and movement of the air that was unprecedented on the battlefield. So in the barrage for the week preceding the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, there were 1.6 million shells fired by regular artillery. There were also mines and explosions from them, and long-range artillery that could fire up to 8 miles. This constant racket was seen to be connected with the emergence of shell shock. It was very quickly explained that a shell shock victim had damage to the nerves caused by proximity to shell explosions. So in the way that somebody could lose an arm or a leg through a piece of shrapnel, one could have one's nerves damaged in a way that was invisible but nonetheless showed the variety of symptoms. This theory ran into some trouble when it became clear that not everybody who had shell shock, far from it, had been near a shell explosion. In fact, a large number of people were nowhere near this. And when the medical boards sought to explain whether this casualty was pensionable, whether they were wounded, they wanted to know whether they were near a shell explosion. Other theories came on to try and explain the illness as it was becoming apparent that it was, and these included a hereditary predisposition, that this was an underlying nervous weakness. There was research done that suggested that 75% of people with shell shock had a history of nervous weakness in the family, and this compared to 10% among other casualties. So that was one theory. Another theory was that this had a psychogenic cause. So there were often uncomfortably apt symptoms arising from the moment of trauma. So somebody who had stabbed an enemy in the bowels might have recurrent diarrhea, unstoppable diarrhea. A sniper who'd been shooting people might go blind. And this was connected to a psychogenic explanation. Perhaps the most well-known casualty who had shell shock is the poet Wilfred Owen, who was sent to Craig Lockhart Hospital in 1917, where he, of course, met somebody who would become his poetic idol, Siegfried Sassoon. Sassoon was also there, having been diagnosed with shell shock, although by a very different mechanism. Sassoon had actually written a letter to his superior officers saying that the war, which had turned from a war of defence and liberation into a war of conquest and aggression, and everybody at the front had been betrayed by this. This letter was read out by an MP in the House of Commons, causing a tremendous stir, as you can imagine. Instead of being court-martialed for this, Sassoon was diagnosed as having shell shock, and he was sent off to Craig Lockhart. So the diagnosis of shell shock is bound up with the public perception of war illness and of public protest about the war. With that, I think I'll let Ed read the poems. The first is by Sassoon and the second by Owen, which was written largely in response to the first, was influenced by the first poem.
Survivors. No doubt they'll soon get well. The shock and strain have caused their stammering, disconnected talk. Of course, they're longing to go out again. These boys with old, scared faces learning to walk. They'll soon forget their haunted nights, their cowed subjection up to the ghosts of friends who died, their dreams that drip with murder. And they'll be proud of glorious war that shattered all their pride. Men who went out to battle, grim and glad. Children with eyes that hate you, broken and mad. Mental cases. Who are these? Why sit they here in twilight? Wherefore rock they? Purgatorial shadows, drooping tongues from jaws that slob their relish, bearing teeth that leer like stars, tongues wicked. Stroke on stroke of pain, but what slow panic gouged these chasms round their fretted sockets? Ever from their hair and through their hand palms, misery swelters. Surely we have perished sleeping and walk hell. But who these hellish? These are men whose minds the dead have ravished, memory fingers in their hair of murders, multitudinous murders they once witnessed, wading slots of flesh these helpless wander, treading blood from lungs that had loved laughter. Always they must see these things and hear them. Batter of guns and shatter of flying muscles, carnage incomparable and human squander rot too thick for these men's extrication. Therefore still their eyeballs shrink, tormented back into their brains, because on their sense sunlight seems a blood smear. Night comes blood black. Dawn breaks open like a wound that bleeds afresh. Thus their heads wear this hilarious, hideous, awful falseness of set smiling corpses, picking at the rope knots of their scourging, snatching after us who smote them, brother, pouring us who dealt them war and madness.
I'll talk for another couple of minutes to take us up to the bell. As I was saying, the volume of the explosions that were cited as the cause for shell shock were so great that they became a matter of boasting. So people would refer to teaspoons rattling in their saucers in London when they were having tea from the noise of the barrage in France and in Belgium. The barrage would last 5 hours at a time, typically continuous, 3 to 4 rounds a minute from each gun, hundreds and hundreds of guns along the front, and there would be a short break, and then it would resume. And these barrages would go on for at least a week preceding an attack. David Lloyd George boasted of a mine explosion that he could hear it in Downing Street, which you can see the political weight behind that kind of statement. Problematic and I think very engaging for any public who could hear that. Because of the preoccupation with physical trauma, the ways in which shell shock was treated varied through the course of the war. To begin with, there were forms of treatment which would really discipline an unruly body. So people who had some sort of stoop would be forcibly straightened. Okay,